Good morning, where we start our day with coherence. I'm your host, Jeremy Tunnell, systems designer and coherence coach. This is week 11, day 51 of our 14-week journey entitled Path of Personal Transformation. Today, we begin a new conversation. We're going to talk about ego all week, not as something you hate, not as something to destroy, but as something we must learn to see, because the ego is dangerous when it becomes the center of who we think we are. The ego will gravitate to any identity that grounds it. The ego does not care if the identity is healthy. It only cares that the identity makes you feel real. It will attach to success, to pain, trauma, intelligence, being right, being wronged. It'll attach itself to being special, even being broken. The ego does not need the identity to be empowering. It needs the identity to be familiar, because the ego feels familiar when it feels safe, even when familiar is suffering. There was a point in my life when I started realizing how much my identity was built around things I thought were just facts about me. I thought, this is who I am. This is how I think. This is how I respond. This is how I protect myself. This is how I move through the world. I had to ask harder questions. Is this really who I am? Or is this just the identity my ego has learned to hold on to so I could feel grounded? Because we don't build identities out of truth. We build them out of survival. We become the strong one because we were never allowed to be vulnerable. We become the funny one because humor helped us avoid feeling pain. We become the independent one because needing people once felt unsafe. We become the intellectual one because feeling was too overwhelming. We become the spiritual one because ordinary insecurity felt exposed. We become the victim because pain gave us a place to stand. We become the achiever because accomplishment gave us a reason to feel worthy. At first, these identities may have helped us. They may have protected us, help us survive, make sense of the chaos. But eventually, what once protected us can begin to imprison us. And that's when the work must begin. The ego looks for identity because identity gives it structure. Identity tells the ego, this is who I am. This is where I belong. This is how I stay safe. I get seen. I avoid shame. I maintain control. The ego will use anything to create that structure. It can use your wounds or your wins, your beliefs, your relationships. It can use your title, your pain, your purpose. It can even use your healing. That's what makes it so deceptive, because the ego does not always look like arrogance. Sometimes the ego looks like insecurity. Sometimes it looks like perfectionism, people-pleasing. Sometimes it can look like self-isolation or over-explaining. It can often look like needing to be understood. Sometimes it looks like constantly proving that you are good, worthy, right, needed, special. Do these things sound familiar? Here's the danger. Once the ego finds an identity that grounds it, it will begin to defend that identity, even if the identity is harming you. This is where we have to slow down, because not every identity is false. Some identities are actually quite useful, like being a parent, being a teacher, a leader, being a creator or a builder or a healer, taking on discipline or responsibility. These can all be meaningful. The danger is not having the identities. The danger is becoming possessed by them. The danger is when an identity becomes so central that you cannot evolve beyond it. When you cannot be questioned or wronged, when you cannot change or imagine yourself without the role, the wound, the story, the title, desire, the version of you, that is when identity becomes a cage. And many people are not trapped because they lack potential. They're trapped because their ego is loyal to the identity. Even if that familiar identity keeps them small. This is why some people can say they want peace, but they keep identifying with the chaos. Or they want love, but they keep identifying with abandonment. Perhaps they want growth, but they keep identifying with the old story. That's the hard truth, but it's important because peace often requires us to release the identities that made our pain feel meaningful. The mind organizes experiences through story. We do not just experience life, we narrate it. We create meaning out of it and roles. We develop patterns. Those conclusions become identity. Something happens once and the mind says, that hurt. Something happens repeatedly and the mind says, this is what life is. Something happens deeply and the mind says, this is who I am. Once the ego turns an experience into an identity, it becomes much harder to release. Because you are not just changing a habit, you are changing a self-concept. You're not just saying, I want to respond differently, but maybe I'm not who I thought I had to be. That is why transformation can feel threatening. Even positive change can feel destabilizing when the ego has been grounded in an old identity. Because healing does not only ask us to release pain, it asks us to release who we became in order to survive that pain. From a systems perspective, identity is a stabilizing structure. It gives your human system a path. A person says, this is who I am, and then their thoughts, emotions, behaviors, relationships, and environments begin organizing around that. So if the identity is, I'm always overlooked, the system begins scanning for evidence of being overlooked. If the identity is, I'm the strong one, the system begins rejecting vulnerability. If the identity is, I'm not safe, then the nervous system begins organizing around threat. If the identity is, I'm superior, then the system begins rejecting humility. If the identity is, I'm broken, the system begins resisting wholeness. This becomes a feedback loop. Identity creates perception. Perception cultivates behavior. Behavior develops outcomes. And outcomes reinforce identity. And then the person says, see, this is who I am. But from a systems lens, that may not be true. That may be the reinforcement at work. The system keeps producing evidence for the identity, and the ego is attached to it. So the question becomes, am I living from truth, or am I living inside a self-reinforcing identity loop? Culturally, we're surrounded by identity reinforcement. Everything asks us to define ourselves. What do you do or believe? What side are you on? What group do you belong to? What trauma explains you? What success validates you? What label contains you? What aesthetic represents you? What personality type describes you? What diagnosis names you? And some of these tools can be useful, but they become dangerous when they replace self-awareness. Because once an identity becomes socially rewarded, the ego has even more reason to protect it. Now, it's not just internal. Now the identity gets attention and validation and sympathy, status. It gets to belong and it gets community. And the ego loves anything that gives it belonging without requiring challenge to transform it. This is why people can become attached to identities they claim they want to outgrow, because that identity may be painful, but it also is rewarding them. It gives them a place, a language, a role, a reason. But at some point, we have to ask, is this identity helping me become whole, or is it helping me remain familiar? So today, don't simply ask yourself, who am I? Ask, what identity am I using to feel grounded? What story am I defending? What version of myself am I afraid to outgrow? Because the ego will attach itself to anything that will give it stability. Pain, pride, fear, misunderstanding, being needed or being right, even being the one who never needs help. But transformation requires a deeper kind of grounding, a grounding in self-awareness, self-reflection, self-regulation, and ongoing self-inquiry. The ability to say, I can observe this identity without becoming it. I can honor what protected me without being ruled by it. I can release the version of me that helped me survive when it no longer needs help. Work is Right there, the ego wants identity, but the deeper self wants truth. Today, spend a little time in your journal and explore the questions: what identity has my ego been using to feel grounded? And what would become possible if I no longer... Let's move into our breath work. We're going to practice for about 5 minutes. So find a comfortable seat. Roll your shoulders back, sit up straight. And let's clear ourselves first with a big inhale through our nose and exhale even longer out through your mouth with a sigh. Get all that air out. Do it again. Let's target our hearts and breathe in through our nose for about 5 or 6 seconds. Through your mouth for 5 or 6 seconds. Let's begin a gratitude list in our mind as we breathe in. I'm thankful for the day, thankful for my support system. Exhale through your mouth. If this resonates with you, stay with the work. Because this week, we're not attacking the ego. Clearly we see it, the less control it has over us. The ego will hold on to any identity that makes it feel real, even the ones that keep us from becoming free. Take a breath. I'll see you tomorrow morning.